Okay, so this is, let me go back. Lecture 12 already, including our talks. And just right after Halloween, this is what the cover letter is kind of a phantoms sculpture. This is famous Giacometti sculpture, right? And it's a little bit symbolic of the society, but the solitude of a modern city, and something which is very much in purpose, much connected to Galibondon, which you have a small society, but also a lot of loneliness there. But we are going into the urban landscape just to give more examples. So just this is kind of repeating. Let me change the. Okay, now I will be alone in the recording. Modernity has this kind of a fight between building as a standalone element, as a city, as a different reality. And we have this guy we already spoke a lot, Aldo van Eyck. We could go into Louis Kahn, right? But okay, I chose Aldo van Eyck because I'm sorry if I insist on him, but it's much more than usually it is considered. And again, sorry if I repeat, his playgrounds, some of them still exist, but are an example of doing a lot with very little, which is not obviously nowadays. So nowadays, like a lot of colorful and over-designed kind of small amusement parks, and not so much about connecting children with elements which just suggest the play, like suggesting, right? So you don't have a crocodile island or kind of a princess castle as we see today. It's like very abstract elements in which the imagination just puts most of the part. And you include in the parental space, you have a nice sunshine and landscape. So making a lot with very little, with a minimum. Without being necessarily a minimalist. Yeah, Dutch are practical, but not necessarily minimalist, but suggest is the point. So you can find in published material, and in some cases, the playgrounds are not so easy to make. I don't think that still exists, but there are places in very dense environment in which, curiously, the design just works also with the shades of the buildings, right? So you have the proper sunshine when you are possible, and then you play in the shade. But see how children just make their own, how do you say, their organization of the space just by having given minimum tools. And something which is always success with children is the earth, right? The earth or soil, ground, yeah, is like, I think that's universal. Whenever one child has something we can change with his hands, they prefer so much to the solid ground. Solid ground is where you run, you have adventures, of course you climb, you do things, but imagination is enough for that. And with that minimalism, there is design here. So there is not just a boring addition to a really boring space. This is a poster by, I think, his presentation in the CIAM, Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, so International Congress of Modern Architecture. I think it was in 1958, where the Team 10 appeared. It's the moment in which modernity was questioned. And by us, for us, is the typical word of democracy, right? Something for everybody. And it's not rejecting the tradition, right? Like a vernacular, classical, and modern. There's always discovery, right? Change and novelty. Is how curiosity and how we can make things always the same, but always different by changing our behavior. So it's one interesting vision, because modernity was like making a revolution and telling, no, all past is terrible. which is not always true. We have to make something modern. It was like a more assuming all those ways of life have their own characteristics, their own advantages, their own place of being, but life changes, society changes, so we need to make the same but in a different way, which is an interesting way to have both continuity and creativity. Well, try to say innovation, but again, innovation is a very tricky word, and I think it's over abused. It's a bit pretentious. I think creativity is the point, right? So if you go to any of his projects, I will show some of them we comment often. The sculpture pavilion is very small masterpiece. It is open air, also it has a ceiling. I don't know if the ceiling was originally there. This is a very recent restoration of the building. Probably was totally open air. This is inside the park, so there's only one pavement border, which creates the limit. You don't need even to have an enclosure for it. And it's very simple. You have a grid, which happens only in the center, and in purpose, the grid doesn't go to the exterior, so those walls suggest some continuity. This is some green, I think some green wall, right, green fence, which plays with the trees, which are kept inside. And then everything plays with this grid. And you can see one example of what we insist often. The grids are reference, and every wall is very well with much discipline, but those circles sometimes come to the middle, sometimes not, sometimes go to the third, right? So they're not exact, but important accent is in the center. And then this is not a very fast design. Otherwise, it took a lot of effort to do this. Some of you know already, there's like maybe 100 sketches to reach this point. If you study the spaces, of course, you have this kind of connections, transversal connections, right, which are quite apparently random, right? So they create a parallel correlation, but you have also the spaces created, like this kind of shifted, right, spaces, or this kind of tree, which has a, let's change the color, which has a kind of uncentered space, right? Or quite interesting, this central element, which has some surrounded space and creates kind of a narrowed and then widened, or widened and narrowed space. So there's like a really exhibition rooms there, but they're only suggested. And why do I say that? Because some of you are struggling with making a nice living space or a nice urban space. And probably by working this kind of minimum actions, you can create those street spaces, those narrowings, those widenings, which create some life to the experience of the street, not just a continuous boring 4 meter width because the engineering regulations tell you about it. Let's erase this. And this kind of discipline in projects, you have less freedom, and churches are very difficult. This is a church space again. Wheels, another difficult project. You have a geometry of just a square and circles. There's almost perfect squares, right? Also, the composition suggests a much longer rectangle, but actually it's just suggestion. It's just 2 squares and 4 circles, nothing more. But shapes are incomplete. By seeing part, you know you reconstructed the full size, the full element, but those elements are connected. So you create a very, very interesting dynamic space with broken axialities or suggested axialities, right? See how the squares, while the circles have elements in the axis, the squares have always the opening through the diagonals, right? So the treatment of circles and squares is quite different. And of course, you have the in-between spaces, which probably are the real access, right, from the city. Again, this has some connection to the gallery, which is so, but quite interesting way to integrate a building in the landscape. The Orphanage, we know it was his masterpiece, and this is one of the few works of Aldo van Eyck which remain in all books of history. This is a famous photo, right, of children playing there. But I want to stress the fact that very often you just say, okay, this is both furniture, so you can sit, right, and building, but it's more than putting a bench. This is also suggesting a centrality, right, with an entrance, but with some irregularity. So this 90 degrees is change there. You have a gate, which is symbolic gate, right? It's a door because you have no wall. There's some kind of a symbolism or some kind of a, or maybe symbolism is too much, but some elements which are a little bit surprising, right? You have separated the space with a door, but without a wall. And then that modulation, which is always there with the structure and the enclosure of the building, which gives regularity to the building. Of course, the columns, which fascinate our friend Don Hui, but which is not all, right? Columns, solids, and voids play a lot of roles in Aldo van Eyck architecture. Let's go back in time. We are speaking of 1923, when the Barcelona Pavilion was done. Probably it was 1926. I always confuse the date. And the reconstruction in 1992. So the photos of the reconstruction, of course. Why do I show this photo? Because the Barcelona Pavilion is always a kind of masterpiece. People say if Mies van der Rohe died that year, he would have his place in history of architecture, because that building, together with the house in Brno, right, were outstanding to make some architectures to be special in the history. But there's not only just the fluidity of the space, those kind of abstract planes, that flat roof, that transparency. Is the building, you realize that the platform and the landscape is more than half. So landscape is more than 50% of the building, right? It's not just putting a piece, as it happens with many of the buildings in the exhibition. Many of them disappeared, some of them remain, right? So that's the relation between the void and the building, not just the continuity, the breaking of the barriers and having open and continuous space, is something which is outstanding. It's not always so appreciated. And that puts Mies van der Rohe just well above many orthodox second-rate modern architects, right? In which they just concentrated on having a beautiful building without much influence or much connection with the context itself. Well, you can read deeper into that, but I think it's important vision of Mies van der Rohe that we need. And when he jumped into America, the Seagram building, which was already 1957, right? Mies van der Rohe was quite old at the time. We had this building which is not only elegant, it was the first time that I know that somebody decided to leave the half or a big portion of the plot just to the city. Look how New York was done. So the traditional plots were just the towers filling the space between streets and having this kind of pyramidal development, right? So you have the sunshine, the street. What Mies van der Rohe did was to make an elegant minimalistic tower with a lot of space for the city. Exactly the same he did with the Barcelona Pavilion like 30 years earlier. This changed radically the way skyscrapers were thought in America. Almost all modern skyscrapers in the States have this kind of a square in front. And this is something we also inherited here. So best towers in Seoul have a nice space in front, right? Most nice ones. Forget Chamsil New Tower. They have a shopping center and very tiny and very ugly open space in front of it, just in the back of the tower. Whatever, the point is that minimalistic small pavilion, monumental tower, in both cases, the integration of urban space is a huge element. And in this case, the tower is so solid and this void is so strict that it created a huge impression in the landscape of New York. Now we are used to it, but on that time it was a shock. How on earth nobody thought about it before? Well, about towers in Seoul, you have quite a few nice towers. I don't remember the names, and we have ugly towers with nice open space. The Samsung Tower in Cheongno, right, which is now WeWork, something like that, by the Argentina office. I forgot his name now. Well, the tower is so-so, but it has quite a wide space in front, right? This is the idea. Chanshil Tower is not too bad on itself, but the urban landscape is just a pure shopping center, and something doesn't work well there, right? You have very nice towers, but what was the name? Kim, the one who studied with Mies van der Rohe, he has a nice tower very near Cheongno Tower in Cheongno, which is quite elegant. And there's quite a few ones, so there's quite a few towers there. Kim Soo-geun, no, Kim Soo-geun, well, yes, but how many towers we have? Well, we have several towers by Kim Soo-geun and nice ones also, right? But it was another Kim. Kim Chung-op studied with Le Corbusier. I can check. Oh, I have to change the screen, so I cannot check. Whatever. I will tell later because that was important. There's Kim Chung-op, Kim Soo-geun already died. Probably Kim Chun-song, right? Probably that's the words. Kim Chun-song probably is the only still alive of that generation. It's a bit younger than Lee-hit, Kim Soo-geun, Kim Chung-op, Na San-jin, right? Kim Chun-song a bit younger, but must be already 90 years old. I don't know. Well, this guy. So he has some nice towers in the center, quite elegant also. Of course, he studied with Mies van der Rohe, so something remained. Okay, thank you for reminding me. If we see the plan, actually, plan is much more complex than the photo suggests. So the square is probably near 50%. Well, we have the glass, right? But since the pilotis are open, this is a glass. See the continuity of the floor with exterior. You really perceive as a open space, almost 2/3 of the square, right? Part of it in continuity with the exterior, part of it under pilotis, right? And the lobby is just enough. It's not too huge, but it's just what you need. Now we have this idea of the super monumental lobbies, which maybe makes sense, right? And something which is less polished. There is a lower part on the back, which is also part of the door, and it's not so much publicized. This is the vision. So this is the minimalistic tower, but this is also Seagram in the back. And you see the pilotis and the space outside provide quite a generous space outside. And this has to do a little bit with the aesthetics of Giacometti. Some people, this is not my idea. This is very often put together, which is minimalistic square with just some water and some green, make people just walking around as a kind of a Giacometti sculpture, right? One thing which is interesting, this is like a very classical plinth also. The New York is not totally flat. You have some kind of a slope on the streets. So, well, this is the Giacometti sculpture. So you can see the connection of both images. So the building has this kind of a very classical plinth to adapt to the street, but see the size of this stair and see how it even gets some protection from the street. So you have plenty of space and time to go to the entrance. So you can come from one side from the pilotis, or you can have this kind of a more formal, almost like a temple entrance from the side. This is elegant, and I think that demonstrates a very good sense of proportion and circulation and landscape. I will compare with one building I saw just this weekend in Gangnam, right? Quite elegant tower, but come on. Of course, the graphics are terrible. It's graphic design. The door is kind of monumental, but come on, the steps are falling out. This is like a almost ridiculous garden there. Of course, you have the space for parking, but it's not just a stump into the cars coming to the street, and you are just in the border, right? And this kind of flag masts are ridiculous there. So this is not. We have worst examples, but you see the difference between a really, really well thought out ceremonial entrance with a very well connected exterior space and something which is very much a kind of robotic, kind of automatic design. Also, proportion might be okay. And this is nice tower, quite elegant, right? Well, I don't want to insist on that. I hope you can see the difference. If not, just put both the slides when you have the handout and compare them. We go almost 30 years on time, and Philip Johnson was the partner of Mies van der Rohe in Seagram. And he kind of brought a postmodern, 1980s is the postmodern, right, glory time. And his AT&T building was like wow, he was so ingenious. He made this kind of very funny top to the tower and a very Roman access. But see how he recovered this kind of classical way of using the whole street, but he couldn't avoid Pilotis space, right? Some kind of a portico space to add to that space, which was already standard with Seagram building. Of course, on the back, they have, if this is the tower, right? This is the Pilotis space. They have a big shopping center, I think a big atrium with the glass on the back, which also compensates for that kind of lack of space, but it's kind of more commercial area, right? So this was at the time was commented as a postmodern, but with a good design. So Philip Johnson actually was talented, and whatever he did had some kind of reasonable output. This is the construction, just to show that the construction was pure steel. It was not classical at all. This is only kind of mask of a classicness in a modern building. And that brings that use of the voids. We are in the largest space. There was an artist in 1960s, 70s, Charles Simons, which just used to make small cities in the suburbs of New York. Wherever something just fallen, he made like a miniature creations, which actually were quite delightful. It's kind of surprises, and they brought some joy to the residents of areas which were depressed another way. I bring this because sometimes a city and art have very unexpected connections, and we saw that void in the monumental scale, just the Seagram building or AT&T. This is like the most small thing you may have, and I think it was beautiful. And you see, we have some modern artists in another way trying to bring this kind of surprise or this kind of joy to elements which are usually ugly. And even some artists in which you will not perceive it, that's more kind of Instagrammer action, right? But again, the minimalistic scale is something which sometimes we should also consider, we could consider. And as a small parenthesis or a small insert into urban art, I think lettering is also something we have to consider. I don't know why, whereas Korea has lettering and Hangul as kind of a very fascinating and very much proud development on lettering, the use of that Hangul and any kind of letters is quite lousy. It is quite interesting in commercial, this kind of overwhelming multiplication of letters, but probably the Hangul is not used to or the lettering in general is not used with so much intention. And even in just a plain Kanban, right? The signs. The guys doing that is like a second-rate aficionados, like not really professionals. I don't know why. Well, we have examples in which this is the name of a town near Barcelona, it's Badalona, which is Badalona. You have to get the reading, but it's kind of playing with the letters. You have the lettering also on the ground. This is Barcelona, right? Again, you have to guess because it's not so very clear. We have a kind of tendency now, it's a kind of a trend to put everything in just kind of a 1 meter tall letters in gardens, telling this is the garden of whatever here in Korea. But again, you can make something which is ambiguous. It's some place you can sit on, right? And probably not for the children, but the animals could play with those letters to do some kind of seek and hide thing. So lettering become part of art, part of signage, but also part of that kind of playful elements, which Aldo Vanek also did for children. Also, in this case, it's a bit more ambiguous. Just to bring more examples of towers, this is in Madrid. And Yamasaki, you know, he did the Twin Towers, which disappeared with the 9/11. We have one of his buildings. At that time was the tallest tower in Madrid. And you have a building which is quite elegant. This kind of a really, how do you say, the office guy elegant shirt of the 1980s. And this kind of continues on the floor design, right? With some green, right? One arc, which is kind of a small reference, very minimalistic reference to postmodernism, to that Philip Johnson big arc, but which creates for a very clear entrance in a very solid basement with some green around and some, of course, water and so on. Again, this is kind of going back to the interest of integrating landscape in building, and this is how landscape is done there. Fumihiko Maki, I brought some of his late projects. Fukui Library is in the landscape. We don't have so much open space. But it's interesting to see how the library, which is usually a very solid building, especially the book storage area, has a series of expansions which really melt with the landscape. So you have a building which is not just a solid block as our science library in Annam. Of course, the landscape is different. So Annam science library is not too terrible, not too bad building, but it's kind of a more expansive building, more of the reading areas and the social areas to some more connected landscape. So you have a landscape and building also in a very logical way connected. This is the space around. And the use of water. So you have to make sure when you put water that it can be maintained. Otherwise, that water disappears after the first season. The problem in Korea is that the water freezes in winter. And then since it's emptied in winter, becomes dirty, and then it is in there changed by some wooden deck or some plantings or something like that, right? If you want to make ponds, you make ponds with just a diagonal ending. So you have ice. When it expands, it just goes up. It doesn't break the borders. And then you don't have to worry about the icing of the pond. There are other tricks to avoid it. But in terms of design, this is what the natural lakes do. Yeah. And this is the in-between spaces, right? So we have a bit more examples of Maki. More dense urban space. I think the Pompidou Center in Paris was again very solid building, but I think the space in front of the building is as interesting as the building itself. And probably the most interesting thing is just to have the sloped ground, gentle slope, right? Which was a very intelligent way to connect the height of the surrounding streets with a kind of, you can say sunken garden, but without being sunken. This is like almost one floor going down. And this creates a very much unique experience in which people walk or sit or do activities. It's surprising how such a minimalistic gesture can have so much effect on how we feel and we use the urban space. See, we have green in the borders, we have the building, but in between is all empty. We don't have, well, water is on the sides, right? So we have the water, but it's kind of, whereas the Seagram Explanade by Mies van der Rohe, it was very neutral and like a abstract mathematical. This is very much intention. It has a very strong feeling in people, right? Because as you walk, even if you don't look, you have that very strong experience of going up, going down, or going straight in the same level. Just a construction example, which is a pavement design is also important. And we have a slope, you have to trap the water in between, right? And this is also some slits where you have additional water conduction. So it goes to the sewage of the building. This is one building I show often, of course, my professor, one of them. It was not only one amazing development in reinforced concrete. OISA was very sensitive in the connection of the towers with the ground. And this tower is in a very noisy place. So this is a normal walkway. And he put like a surprisingly oversized handrail. Well, it's like for giant people, it's like a cylinder, like that's a crazy size, which is enough for you not to peep inside, but to know there's something behind. And then that is a very soft separation. There's not a big wall, right? You don't need to make things wall, but something which adds to the interest of the street. It's unexpected elements. It's really, really urban sculpture. Well, this is a Japanese friend looking at it. Of course, granite is very expensive in Spain, so some part was finished in concrete. But that allows to have this kind of sunken, again, to give the access, to give some kind of houses under the street level. This is the access, the lobby of the houses, right? But you have a nice garden wide enough in which you don't see the cars, you don't see people walking around. You have like a really private space without making big fences, without making a big separation. And you remember fences and separation is something which was a key word in our case. We don't have this scale in Garibondon, probably in some border areas with a digital city. But again, there's many ways to address this kind of connections between the very private and quiet urban garden with a very busy street next to it. Oh, that's what design is always interesting, nice. You have some common spaces, also taking advantage of this kind of level difference. And top lights for the parking downstairs. This is the lobby. So I will show, this is not a masterpiece, it's just from a printed work I collected for other works. This is just a park. The interest of this park is using also the minimalistic elements and the water movement as part of the landscape. So you have the sound and the movement of water, right? In our case, since we have the water for sure, and we have the slopes, but water could be one element we use, I'm not sure. But water is very much consubstantial of a Korean traditional architecture. And hanok, some of you are also considering hanok in your talk, so probably you could consider how you introduce water, right? And this kind of working water in moving, staying, and changing textures is also an interesting thing. Or small ponds, right? Like creating small rooms, like breaking the scale of the large open space. Well, it's not very surprising. Something which we commented is and I think you could consider the pervious pavements. So when you have especially cars and people who need to go like a wheelchair, so you need a hard pavement, if you leave the joints open, you may have green. So it's not like a really parking space. We had that kind of parking in Garibondon, right? And you create one space which is actually nice for walking. You can have cars, you can have emergency vehicles, you can go by bicycle or wheelchair, but still green. And that also helps filtrating rainwater, right? Which also helps reducing pollution when it goes to the river, and takes load out of the sewage system because much of the water remains on the ground, apart from being green. Another thing which is interesting is to show the stational change of green. And this is why you have to put your green to plan, right, the species. So you can see which trees will become white, pink, red, or naked in each season, right? And that will be the mix of trees you use. And if you use the blocks of the symbols of trees with a layer or with a kind of script which changes the corresponding color in the seasons, you can have all that color variation of probably maple trees or ginkgo biloba or pine trees, which are always green, cherries, and so on. So you can show that variation in just a few diagrams that you do here. So this is something I encourage you to do because it is very effective and convinces a lot cities and clients. The smaller things. Again, some demonstration of those elevations with the real trees you use. Of course, this is taken from libraries, right? But you have to see the size of the trees when you plant them and as they become adult, so we can know also the variation on the size of those trees. And sometimes we plan, now when they become big, we have to cut some of them, right, to make a space for the rest. That's things we do in the parks. This is another case. We saw two examples of parks. This is an interesting project in a very dense historical center in one city of Spain. This is the east, near the coast. And this is a very dry place, and there is no trees, just water as the natural element. And the interesting thing is that this water is the ceiling of an exhibition space down, which is something we saw here. There was a gallery by Stephen Hall, which opened for 1 year. Now we cannot visit anymore. It's also, I think, used this kind of trick. The only thing with water over glass is that it needs maintenance, right? So you need to filter the water and clean, the same as a swimming pool. You have to clean the glass from time to time, and you have to be very sure you don't have leaks. But in our case, we know it is possible, so we can do it. At night, you can see the exhibition space through the glass. And this is the square. So since you have a all basement down, these are small planters. You have small walls. Again, it's not tall walls to make the difference between what is a street and what is the slow staying space of the building. And the building actually is minimalistic. It was almost not so much. So a small additional public building. So this kind of connection of the old, the new, and the open space is also done very carefully. Of course, stone has to do with the historical buildings. This was quite much celebrated because it kept the character of the old town without breaking the continuity of the space, and was definitely modern. Locals complained a little bit about green, probably. It's the night view, and this is a section. So this is really like a exhibition space underground, building is on top of it. This Girona is a northern part of Catalonia, almost touching France. Again, they have very beautiful historical towns. And this is the street design. They did nothing but design the street. And again, very minimalistic action, just carrying the design of the pavement and some urban furniture, which is probably a little bit over-designed if we compare to the minimalism of Aldo van Eyck, but it's something which is sitting space or playing space for children or hiding space for pets and so on. And what is special here is the integration of the water, right? So many Spanish towns have like they are in a slope. So you have like some kind of small water stream just collected on the tops. On the top, traditionally women would go to wash the clothes, and then the water would run through the town until it reaches the river. And the sections would be like the houses, the street, small channel, and then the houses, right? And in many places, this has just been asphalted and put in a tube. But in many other places, it has been just open and let as kind of a part of the city, because that water is not stained anymore. People now, they all have wash machines. I have seen people washing clothes in the outside until the 1980s in some rural areas, but not anymore. But the sound of water and the presence of water is always quite unique and quite rewarding in a city. And if we have some kind of water opening, cars, when they go, they have to go more slowly because they have to be careful so they don't fall down, which is also great for pedestrians. Again, this is mostly an exercise of pavement redesign, right? And furniture design, and how you keep this kind of water line near the existing buildings. There's not much more you do. And of course, just by changing pavement, you just stress which areas you're creating as movement areas or stay areas in the town. There's the detail of a connection. And you see, when you have a complex pavement, you don't need to draw everything. You draw the detail in one part and you know the rest, it just follows the same system. This is not cheap, it's quite expensive thing because you have to make a lot of individual cuts and you have to make it work. Well, it's just examples on how the water elements are put there. I put this as an example of nice drawing. See buildings, borders, a thick line. Those may be openings. Then the water with the kind of shade. Then just the pavements with the dimensions, just what we need. This is construction drawing, so you need to put the dimensions, but in a clear way. It's not those drawings. We had some drawings in midterm full of dimensions and bubbles and things which are not necessary. You can make those dimension drawings for construction time only, not for a concept design presentation, but without making a mess of numbers which do not let you see the drawing. This is quite an elegant way of putting dimensions in a complex, very complex design. That's the result. The result of that complexity is almost non-existent. The design of the tiles lets you suggest some kind of direction and scale, right? But you recover the water, so probably you forget somebody took care of making this flooring, this kind of pavement design, which probably is one of the ideals of urban design, not being so much narcissistic of putting your imprint and making something which is much more related to the city itself. Obviously, some more photos, right? Because of regulations, sometimes you have to make those handrails, and this is also quite a hard element because we don't know if this is more dangerous than not having anything, but okay. If you are wise enough, like those small ramps, so you have places for playing, and we go back to what we said about Aldo Panic, right? In which benches and the landscape elements become both decoration, but also elements of play and stay, depends on the users. And this connects to his poster, which I saw before. The same, but not the same. We do the same, but in a different way. Or we have the same things, but felt and used in a different way, which is very much intelligent saying. Another shift in aesthetics and ideas, 1960s, archigram is kind of the science fiction peak of time, the dreaming. It was when we were preparing the space trips. We have the first satellite, Sputnik, on the space. We're preparing for going to the moon. So this kind of fiction feature had a group interested in archigram. One of them is Peter Cook. Actually, this is like a new or recent comic. Peter Cook is one of the oldest living members of this team. And they were doing this kind of a lot of drawings and a lot of ideas which were very crazy. Instant City probably was one of the most interesting ones. Instant City, in which they say, the moment you have a kind of roof, you can make a city anywhere. And it's just hanging from balloons, right? This is much, much before we have the Up movie from Disney, right? In which the building was floating from a balloon. It will be anchored, and then just three-dimensional structures will help having all the base for this kind of activities you will have, which were very detailed. So everything which was happening there was done in a way that, even though it's futuristic, they designed and they drew in a way that they thought it was possible to build. So in their own words of the Instagram of the Archiram guys, the doors in their correct places, the toilets are where they have to be, and they have the right size, and everything works, right? Only they didn't have the technology to build it. But this is something which still you can consider, because now we can build many of those things, right? We have a technique for that. And we can make cities which appear, disappear as we need them. This was a big hit. This is, they had examples on how it could be done. This is Monte Carlo. Actually, Monte Carlo was a big competition in which my professor, the one of the concrete tower I saw before, submitted a very surprising element. But after he saw this, he said, wow, mine was so poor, so boring. This is an amazing thing, right? Even though everything is realistic, so the structures work and the things are possible, this is quite fast and suggesting. This is a suggestion of a possibility, right? Not really a full construction project. So they have plenty of versions and illustrations, and in this case, a collage was part of the aesthetics. Again, collage, you can use collage in your presentations. It's not that idea. It's very effective if you choose the correct images and you make sure the buildings really show as they should. So very often in the collages, in the renders, we have too much anecdotes. So people are in the first plan, but in the border is the drawing, so they don't confuse so much. Careful with collages, with renders, sometimes the props, the images of people are distracting the building, which is, or the space we create, which is the important thing. Plugin City is the other subject. Again, very seriously done, and those drawings are huge drawings done by hand. Some of them are in British museums. I saw some of the drawings in the Victoria Albert Museum, and you can see the corrections with white, the stain of the hands when they unwillingly put some kind of thing. So it's really, really humanly made drawings. But again, this is kind of a frame where you just put elements, and the infrastructure will bring all the necessary water, electricity, right? And this could be a self-built city of elements, which could be dismantled or growing organically according to its needs. The Montreal habitat, for example, is inspired on those ideas. It's more or less the same time, right? Also, it's not exactly the same kind of construction. But again, this is a design in which each element is more than an illustration. So if you go to the capsules, the little elements that are designed very convincingly. They put everything which really work in their own function, which gave this project much value in that sense. This is like an exaggeration of how that city could grow, right? Well, many of those and many science fiction movies took advantage of those drawings, those images to make their own compositions, their own backgrounds. But you can take elements one by one, right? And you analyze them and you see they are quite logical in terms of the modulation. This is housing elements, right? The initial bits, the open courtyards, the connections, the vertical cores, everything is quite logical and very much well proportioned. Here you see the corrections, right? The different elements they have, even with a very detailed program. See also the timeline in the drawings, right? And how many things we have difficulty to put in your presentations here is made very clearly. Because when you have a hand drawings, you have to plan very carefully. So the composition takes more time. Now we have our PowerPoints and our computer, and we just put things out, and we throw them as we produce them. But if you have to spend probably one day making this drawing, before you start, you plan very carefully what you put there and how you do it, so you don't need to repeat, and the result is clear. Well, as I said, those drawings are now in the museums, right? And this is one of the walking city is another project. So you have the instant city, plugin city, walking city. Probably the most radical and the most unbelievable. So this city would not disappear as the instant city, would not just grow as it time passed. This would move just around the world, right? this is more science fiction and more theoretical, but curiously, we have in the 2000s, Dominguez was a young architect. Now he must be close 50, but his graduation project was a huge, enormous moving city, in which, again, with today's technology and possibilities, he really designed one thing which could happen. I don't think nobody does it, but this was done before that science fiction movies. We have London attacking and eating other cities and so on, right? So we have some ideas which still some people find inspiring to make like a utopian proposal for the future. That may happen or not, I don't know. It's really amazing. Again, these are diagrams which are really calculated and studied in a way that they could be actually possible. Let's go back again to the traditional streets. I add this. Yes, so I think Mortal Engine was after this project, right? Probably. Go back. This was a James Sterling Prize of Urban Design in 2019. And curiously, it was a housing project which was recovering the street space. So very much what we are doing. This reminds me the industrial city, right? Charles Gardien, we saw in our first lectures, which we have formal streets where you can access with the car. There is a common parking for the houses and some spaces in the street, and then a green street on the back, which is mostly pedestrian. So you have like two sides of the houses, right? And this green will be also a soft connection with the neighbors. So all borders, when possible, you have some kind of a green, right? So being very simple, it's like in a simple way made an urban setting, which was quite successful. And curiously, it was published also. We should have many of those. Of course, sun studies, something you can add to your project, and just one drawing convinces of why you take decisions on distances and heights and so on. This is piece of the street, right? This is the part of the cars, but you have as much space as possible for pedestrians, and it's just the one car which has to go slowly because it has not plenty of space with the slowing down elements. And then the pedestrian street on the back, which brings a much more quiet, clean environment and safe environment for everybody living there, right? All those screens and so on. Shinonome, we already commented, so I will go fast into just as a reminder of those images, how important is the street also, that pedestrian street, which allows cars only in given moments. And then I will end with one very recent development. That's the super blocks in Barcelona. I think Junho already mentioned them there. So Barcelona, 19th century city, was very scientifically done. So Emmanuel Cerda, he made the statistics of all possible things you can think in terms of population health, regarding orientation of streets, directions, deaths, sicknesses, and so on. So he put the direction of the grid was supposed to be the most healthy one in terms of the direction which had less problems with health. And then the distance between blocks, which I think is 150, 120 meters, were very much based on car movement. We're speaking of the late 19th century, right? So you have visibility in the crossings and they have plenty of space. And the blocks were thought as kind of a gardening areas. So you have these two sites which already Garnier proposed, and we saw in that last British project, right? So you have streets for moving, for communication, also you can walk. You have a very private garden, so you have two sides to the streets, one very quiet, very static, one very dynamic. In the end, with time, and that happened also in Madrid, the blocks are completely blocked and completed, and even the courtyards are very often built with additional industries and storages and factories and so on. But that was the idea. What happens 100 years later? is that the city is overwhelmed with so much circulation, so the blocks are filled, and there's not so much of that internet space, and the street is just the realm of cars. So the idea, Salvador Rueda was the architect who proposed this. Actually, not architect, I think he's geographer. He proposed just to close sets of 9 blocks, right? Which could be probably 400 meters, 500 meters. So you keep always the main circulation, but the local circulation will be only for residents and would be mostly pedestrian. It was proposed as an experiment, and it has been tested, and we have some of the ideas they have. So that's the presentation. It's very convincing. And if you put the streets of Seoul, it can be even more dramatic. We have a nice walk space, but it is invaded by motorcycles. We cannot go to the street, and streets are very inconvenient for people, actually. And the asphalt is totally taken by cars. So how can we improve this? They made a whole plan for the whole city, which is interesting. We cannot do so much, but interestingly, they put the main movement areas, the connection with the green. This is something that Jun Hyun, for example, proposed last semester, that green corridor connecting mountain, the city, and then in the case of Barcelona, the sea, right? There's something you have also in Busan. I remember you have this kind of streets going from the mountain to the sea, but the connection to the sea is difficult always because that border is always occupied by some highway, which happens in almost every city. And then you have so this is the 19th century expansion, right? This is the whole proposal of area. And here you see this some adaptation to the possibilities of each place. So here is where the main idea has to be implemented on what the plan allows you to make. This is like the empty spaces which become mostly pedestrian. And this is how the resulting super blocks, right, made of 9 would result with the strategies for transportation, parking, and so on. So you limit the conflict points, and you have much more space, and those squares become more of a civic space than just a movement space for cars. This is the study on how things can be implemented, right? So there's plenty of studies on cars and the pedestrians, and this is like the process of doing it, like progressively closing and being totally pedestrian, and starting creating those meeting points provisionally closed until they become like a finally consolidated green areas. So that's like kind of a timeline and strategy to make this possible. I will not go into detail. This is a Rueda's drawing, but this is kind of the sustainable diagram, right? In which he shows the full section with all the programs, parking, common spaces, co-working, living, commercial park, training, connection with the subway, groundwater used for geothermal and water and so on. So the full section of the city, including the mining space, right? With all the kind of uses they have, demonstrating a total balance use of the ecosystem. This is very ambitious, and this has been a very much developed project. But this is from the original thesis of Rueda. There's 3 levels, right? The building, ground, and underground, right? But this kind of diagram in your sustainability strategy, maybe by groups, could be a big hit. And if you cannot do this time, maybe keep it in mind for following years, in which you have always to propose your sustainability. And I think this is great, very ambitious diagram, which has a lot of information and you could use in your presentations. I'm repeating myself. I'm getting nervous because I'm taking too much time. So one thing which is interesting is, again, how can we make this possible? For some reason, Salvador Rueda had the idea, the geographer, with the architects, And at some time, the city mayor just supported it, and then they had to convince the citizens. And they had like 3 levels of acting. The basic, which is something we saw in Seoul, just the painting, and they have these kind of bicycle roads and so on. Tactic actuations, which are temporary actuations. So you say, okay, let's put less cars and more space for pedestrians. So let's put some free space, which can be changed later. That's what they call tactical, something which is reversible. And finally, structural things, which is just permanent change, things which are parked and will be parked forever. So that way, you can start implementing things slowly and with a very small effort, improve the space, test how it works in terms of testing, right? In terms of acceptance for the citizens, so you can fine tune before you go to the final decision, which might take years over, but you can do these initial acts in just a period of weeks or months, right? Then you see how it works, fine tune, and after experiment, after 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 years, 20 years, you can make the permanent change, which you see it will not be blocking posterior developments. I think it's one intelligent way of acting, and it became kind of a normal language. It's kind of a basic, right? Tactical is about the war, and then structural. Okay, 3 levels of action you can take in an urban development. Whereas the official planning is just a planning and developing, and that's the end, right? And then changes come very slowly because things are already structural from the beginning. Some examples of existing streets and proposal. So this is a tactical proposal in which you have a reduction of cars and that parking space added for the pedestrians without big changes, using painting on the asphalt to make cars go slower, and gained space for people with planters and movable elements. Here you already have design, right? Of course, we shouldn't copy this. We may have our own ideas. I have seen things like this all around Seoul and other cities, right? Just painting the floor, changes a little aspect and putting planters and so on. But it's kind of in between step to check how those spaces work and then prepare for the next step, which would be demolishing this or moving this somewhere else because it doesn't work, or making it structural with some changes to make it final, right? So there's like elements used. Again, to explain the elements, you have like a planter, big planter, small planter, on land planters, and just small elements which are traversa is like a small block. So it can be for sitting, for playing, for just separating spaces, right? And with this, you create those spaces which, if they are successful, the moment people taste them and use them, usually they work very well. And then they become permanent very easily. At the beginning, there's a lot of opposition from users. People are used to have their car everywhere, and why this guy can have his car in his house and I cannot go with mine. And the merchants always think people not go to the shops and so on, but in the end, people in the street means more people going to the shops in the end. Since there's the final images, just examples. This is well published, but I wanted to share. So this is already structural, some street which already changed. And there's a huge difference of the cars and motorbikes parked everywhere, and city where you can just enjoy green and walking spaces. This is the tactical between space activities, right? People happy. Of course, this is the city of Barcelona always sells this a big success. But in the few years they did it, it has been very much published and expanded and politicized. And we have experiments, similar experiments in other Spanish cities, including Madrid. I don't know if we will implement it, because if it comes from Barcelona, people are a little bit, there's kind of competition between cities. But also some other cities are using this experience to know how they could implement similar things in other parts, right? And this is as much as I wanted to say. We're just on time for a short break before I start addressing you. Any comment or question regarding this? Wow, Jung-Hyun just is like just a mouth opener presentation. Okay, So just I think a few examples. Maybe some of them were known, but probably the vision or the interest they have in our own design is what I wanted to stress in this case, right? Strategies, the concept, the intention to have this building and city space integrated, but also the infinite ways of working with this one space. And also the last example, well, probably Albanic, but probably the last example of Barcelona, how you can express, how can you sell this idea in your presentations, right? In that case, the Salvador Rueda and City Barcelona were very, very clever on how they published several pamphlets to convince, of course, investors, policymakers, and also the citizens, especially, this could be an improvement of the city. And in the end, with some small exceptions, it has been quite successfully done in some areas. I'm not sure they will expand to the whole city, but some areas are already working with that kind of change. Anything? No questions? Okay, then you're so quiet. Probably tired already from my time. You know, if it is marathon, we are in the kilometer probably 25, 26. So still almost 20 kilometers to run. So nobody has the right to be tired, right? Now it's keeping the rhythm. If you keep the rhythm, you have nothing to worry about. Of course, you have to keep using your brains also. Otherwise, you just to work with is not so useful. Let's have a 10 minutes break. And in 10 minutes, we come back. So at, let me see, it's 3:34, so 35. So let's come back at 4:45. And probably in 1 hour, I can just scold everybody. Oh, I think I didn't allow the, yes, I didn't allow. Why cannot I? Okay, now. It's not letting me, so I will do from here. Let's have more. I couldn't put the, okay, whatever. I cannot put the for some reason, the screen is not, the whiteboard is not getting in the way. So let's stop. I will come back at 4:45. I'll put in the chat, okay? No, sorry, 3:45. Because 2:45 is 3:45. If you have some question or something to comment, tell me then. Otherwise, I will just keep scolding you each. Okay, see you in 10 minutes.